mean, it's a small group. I think we can do it very casual and like, you know, interact whatever way we want. And basically, I mean, thank you, Yang-Shi, for the invitation. And I think, in general, I would like to start out by defining what I mean by an ecological network, because I don't know if you go to network conferences, workshops, I think this is like still a highly underrepresented topic. And despite the fact that many of the methods, the questions, the challenges, and things that we are doing is very much similar to what, you know, social people looking at social networks, economic networks, or any type of network are doing. So in that sense, I love the opportunity to talk to small, big audiences, because, you know, any little thing opportunity that I have just to, you know, to explain a little bit of what my research community is doing for me, it's fascinating. So in that sense, ecological networks for us is like basically this synthesis, this result of the interaction between the species sharing the same geographical area in both time and space. And that's basically, you can have interactions that can be mutualistic, antagonistic, commensalistic, any type or combination of these interactions that you can think of. And so in these cartoons here, the one on the top would correspond to a mutualistic network, that where each node would be simply the individuals of one single species. Let's say the red dots on the top would be seed dispersers, birds in the majority of time. And you have on the bottom, the green circles, those would be plants or flowering plants. And the links would be the mutually beneficial interactions between these two types of species. So that would be a mutualistic network. The cartoon at the bottom would correspond to an antagonistic network, typically known as food webs. Food webs would be the representation of who eats whom. So it's different. Sometimes you would see in the literature, ecological networks, food webs. These are different things. Food webs are always when you implies that someone is eating something. And on the other side, you only have a competition system or a mutualistic system, and so forth. So the cartoon at the bottom would correspond to this antagonistic network between predator and their prey. So each link would mean that that particular predator was eating that other animal during a particular period of time. Now, this is basically what we have, and we know a lot about these networks thanks to also the work, I have to say here, of plenty of field ecologists that they have been going out to the field and collecting, recording all the different types of interactions. So fortunately, it's not like sometimes you can do this web crawling and get all the interactions from the economy or social networks, whatever. Here we have to go to the field or do some experiments to actually infer those interactions. So it gets a little bit more complicated. And of course, there's a lot of error in terms of like, you know, human error, measurement errors. But pretty much we have, I think, a good representation of many of the types of interactions and ecological networks that we see out there. Now, these, of course, would correspond to snapshots. And thanks to these snapshots, we can recollect a little bit of the structure, and this has given us a lot of insights about more or less how the topology of these networks look like. And also from here, we have been able to infer the dynamics of these systems. But of course, we know that ecological systems are changing, are dynamic. Environmental change is modifying interactions, is modifying the composition of communities. So not only in these ecological networks, species are changing, but also the interactions are changing. So how does this reorganization of interactions then impact the long-term persistence of ecological networks? That's still like an open question, and it's pretty much what my group is trying now to do at MIT. We are trying to understand the role of these short-term interactions into the long-term persistence of these systems. And trying to do that, today I would like to talk a little bit about well, I would divide my talk into two parts. The first part, I'm going to be giving you a little bit of the challenges, a little bit of the tools that we are using in order to then to investigate this link between the reorganization, but especially the link between the structure and the dynamics of ecological systems. And in the second part, I would give you an example of an ecological network under which we have been able to observe this organization and trying to infer the dynamics of it. So basically, when I was giving you all these details about the topology and about the structure of networks, I was never talking about the dynamics, and that's because that's even less information that we have. So we might have some information about a topology, but we lack a lot about the time series of the abundances of these species. So the majority of time, what we do is basically rely on ecological models, which are the descriptors, right, or what we think are the natural processes out there in nature. Of course, many of the ecological models, mathematical models in particular, are phenomenological, especially when you go to more than 3 species. Everything becomes quite complicated, and then you have to deal with phenomenological models that basically are reducing a lot of the complexity into just a handful of parameters, so that at least we can make sense of what is going on. But at the end, what we are interested in is in a general global pattern of the ecological system. So in this particular case, this is a mathematical model for a mutualistic system, where in this case we have the rate, so given by these ordinary differential equations, the per capita growth rate of the population. Say the P would correspond to a plant, so if you have plants and animals, P would correspond to the population, the abundance of the population of plant I, and on the bottom equation you would have the equation for the abundance of the animal I as well. And here the parameters R would be the intrinsic growth rates, so that is very internal to the organism, to the species, and is completely independent from the competition and from the mutualistic benefits that they will receive. So typically this would be like the number of eggs, the offspring, basically, that a species can generate. And if you want to measure this, you have to do it in isolation or in monocultures, so that you can estimate, have a better estimation of what would be this growth rate in the absence of interactions. Now the second term would be this negative effect that a particular, say, if we are plants, then another plant is competing for space, is competing for light, is competing for pollinators. So we have to modulate this competition. And here then would be the parameter beta ij, which is basically the effect, the per capita effect that the plant J exerts on the plant I. And in the same way we have it for the animals, which again, they are competing for space, they are competing for plants. Now, the other part would be the mutualistic benefit. Basically, what much of the effect do I have if I go and pollinate that particular plant? So there is an exchange between pollen, nectar, between nectar and pollen, so that in one sense I get the energy if I'm the pollinator, but if I'm the plant, then this animal is helping me to reproduce by spreading the pollen around the other plants in the community. So this is pretty much, and this is a very simple, basic mutualistic system, model, in which again is phenomenological, but at least it has been useful in terms because it incorporates at least key ingredients that a lot of field ecologists think are necessary in order to understand in a better way the dynamics in these systems, like intrinsic growth rates, the competition, and the mutualistic part in the other side. Now,
are you counting also the self-competition? Like, I mean, when you have a logistic model, you also have, it would be AI times 1 minus AI. Is it?
Yeah. So
okay.
So in this case, you would have the term
the
I, which is the competition with myself. Because of course, as you said, we are also assuming a logistic growth, so you cannot grow more than what you can, the resources that you have and the offspring that you can generate. So, but now here, I mean, if you just look at this thing, then immediately there's something that might be of interest to you, and it's like all the different variables, all the different parameters that we have here. And if I was telling you before that just getting the topology of this ecological network was difficult, imagine how difficult would it be to get each of these parameters out. So it's a big, big challenge. So what have, yes?
Here is the competition part is unbounded, but the mutualistic part is bounded.
It's bounded?
Bounded. It means it's saturated.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, here it's all, again, you can do it without the saturation part,
yes.
And then you would just have a linear case, or you can just put a saturation in case you don't want to. But again, this is all it's all the flavor of what you want to do, how much you want. Also, you can go here, and this is a type 2 functional response, but you can do a type 3, or, you know, I mean, it all depends on how you conceptualize and what you think would be important to incorporate. Here, I'm just not telling you that this is the model that you should follow. I just want you to see that more or less this is the kind of model that we deal with. But more importantly, the challenge that I'm imposing now is like, okay, how should we get all these parameters? How we get all these values? And I think it's also an important question not only in ecology, but also, I imagine, also in socioeconomic systems and in other areas. We have to model these things, and either we do some agent-based modeling and we try to come up with ways of doing it, or simply ignore them by some meaning. So here, if you look then into the literature and you pick up your one, you go to, I don't know, you go to the Nature magazine website, and you just Google Ecological Networks, and you pick one of these papers at random, you would find that the studies showing you that the particular structure that the system has a positive effect on the persistence of the community. Meaning that the persistence would be, if we model this, as it's a Lotka, you can recognize it's a Lotka-Brunner equation. If we model it and we put some parameters, at the end we're going to get some equilibrium. We are likely to get an equilibrium point, and we can count the number of species with abundance greater than 0. Right? So if you have abundance greater than 0, means that at least, even though it has in a small proportion or in a big proportion, that species is alive, it's present in the system. And that's just a criterion. And then you can count the number of species that survive at the end of your simulation relative to the total number of species present in the system. So, and then you can do that with different topologies, different parameters, and basically trying to understand whether this structure that we see here has any effect on that fraction of persistence in our community. And as I said before, many studies have been trying to come up with their own values for these parameters here, and then trying to look for the relationship between persistence and some measure of the network. You can, I don't know, here you can calculate this or characterize this topology by your favorite measure, modularity, nestedness, scale-free, whatever you want to do it. So you characterize your network in some particular way, and you plot it against the persistence, the fraction of surviving species at the end of your simulation, and then you see what happens. And then you grab one of these papers that I was telling you about, and positive relationship. You go again, you grab another paper, negative relationship. Now you get another one, and you get no relationship whatsoever. So in fact, we wrote a letter to Nature saying, okay, I mean, this is crazy. We have to stop doing this. So here's, for instance, what I was just telling you. I was characterizing my network with nested patterns. So nested would be that on average, the fraction of shared interactions between any two species in the system. So I'm just but you can put here modularity, or you can put whatever you want. And on the y-axis, you have, here in this case, the partial residuals of this persistence that I was telling you. So on the one side, I'm using some parameters. On the other extreme, I'm using other parameters, and voila, you get your results, right? So whatever, you just tell me what you want me to conclude, and I can put it there. So we have to do it in a different way. So this was basically telling us that we have to think more carefully about doing these things. And if we want to link the effect of a structure on the dynamics, we have to do it in some other way. Because, I mean, as ecologists, we think that, of course, there might be some effect. If something is out there like this, it's costly. Everything that you do in nature is costly. So things are not completely just independent of whenever you see them. So we have to understand in a better way these sort of things. So the way in which we started thinking about this was, okay, we don't know the parameter values, but what we can do is to try to understand the range of parameter values. So instead of just looking at whether my effect, my competition effect was 1 or 2 or 3, I'm not going to care. I'm just going to care about the range of those values. And the idea is then that if, for instance, here on the x-axis, I put the range of a particular vector of parameter values for animals, remember in my two equations, so I can here just characterize each point in this x-axis will correspond to all the parameters for an animal. and in this y-axis will correspond to a vector of parameters for all my plants. Now, here I can see the regions, right, that would match the coexistence, meaning that all my species are alive in the system, so persistence equals to 1. And here then I can see this, the volume, the area that would make my system to coexist. And then the hypothesis is that depending on the type of a structure that you have, this range of parameters for coexistence are going to be modulated, are going to change, right? So one particular structure would only be able, if we put those parameters that we here in this axis here, if we put them into our Log-Taylor equation for these 6 species in particular, then I'll see that the 6 have abundance greater than 0. But if I move my parameters outside of this region, at least one of the species would go out, would go extinct. So the hypothesis is precisely this, that basically depending on the structure that you have, you're going to be changing that. And of course, when we were talking about an mutualistic system, one of the structures that you might read a lot in papers is like this nested structure. And the idea would be then that if we see those things out there in nature, is perhaps one of the reasons is because it's actually increasing the likelihood of survival for that particular system. Because we don't know the effects that are going to produce the environment on my parameters. So if we assume that stochastic perturbations are going to move my parameters around any direction, then we might be able, or we might actually would like to have a structure that could maximize this sort of tolerance and disturbances in the system. So how can we do that? So basically we can just go and instead of thinking about the abundance space, now what we're going to be doing is thinking about the parameter space. So before we were plotting abundances, now what we are going to be caring about is all these parameters that we have in our system. So here I'm just plotting for a 3 species system, and in each one, and here I can basically normalize this by the unit sphere. Obviously my parameter space is infinite, but I'm not going to care about the exact value of these parameters. I'm just going to care about the direction in a vector space. Because if I multiply my vector by any lambda, I'm going to continue in this vector. Only the abundances are going to increase from 2, if I have a lambda of 2, then from 2 to 4, from 4 to 6, but the pattern is going to continue exactly the same way. I'm going to be lying everything on this vector. Now, what I want to do then is like if I just randomly and uniformly sample around this unit sphere, this would be my whole parameter space. And this would be the region under which a particular structure would actually allow us to coexist. So this is what we call the domain of visibility. And the domain is given by the column vectors of my interaction matrix. So the interaction matrix, the column vectors, is basically each column. In this case, we have a 3 species. It's a 3 by 3 system in this particular case. Each of the columns would correspond to this axis here, which is basically constraining the visibility domain of our system. And then with that we have a probabilistic interpretation, because now we can say, okay, here this is the visibility domain, and what is the fraction of this over the entire unit sphere? And the fraction would represent then the likelihood of coexistence of a particular system. And of course we can just do the math, try to get this volume here, normalize it, which at the end it's end up very close to a multivariate Gaussian distribution. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if you want at the end we can talk about it. And with this, now you have a measure for calculating the fraction of or the likelihood of persistence as a function of your topology in the system. And this is one of the results from the science paper that Yang Shi was mentioning, that basically what we found now is that every time nested structure is just maximizing this volume. So the volume that I was showing here, if we change our interaction into a nested structure, this volume is going to be maximized. I don't know right now whether it's going to be maximized in the right direction, because this is something we don't know, right? But it's just going to be maximized. And this is precisely just showing that the effect is always positive. So if I change a network from any random structure to a nested structure, I'm going to be always increasing this likelihood of persistence in my system. So that's fine. And that's basically the ends up with the first part that I wanted to give you today, just the idea of how we are now conceptualizing and understanding these systems, and in a better way, trying to link the structure to the dynamics without having to deal with the actual value of the parameters. We're just looking at the volume space. Now, as we said, I mean, we wanted to look at these networks, and we knew that, or we know that these networks are not static, they are changing. So how can we start understanding these reorganizations in the system? So as an example, we went and we had some colleagues in the Bialowieza National Park in Poland. Here, this is a very nice place to as a field study, because it has been protected for basically for hundreds of years, versus a royal game reserve, then as for managing purposes, and now it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it's a very well preserved, and it's actually one of the last and the best preserved old-growth forest in Europe, and it's home to basically the largest population of European bison in the world. So it's very well preserved, little human activity going over there. And what we know is that in this site, the environmental conditions, so the environment is the driving force of this environment. So it's continental with a strong Atlantic influence, and basically only two types of seasons can be distinguished, like summer and winter. And this not only generates important changes in the environment, but also in the behavioral patterns of the species. So you have here in summer, like the wolf is basically not consuming a lot of bison, whereas in winter you actually see that is the case. So now we know the topology, because of course, like for 20 years there have been a lot of field ecologists trying to understand all these interactions. And what we know now is that basically here it's just a cartoon of, you know, a subsample of all the species that we observed in the system. But what we started looking is just at the vertebrate terrestrial predator-prey system, so we constrain our analysis to that particular set of species. And here in black, I'm showing you the species that were present every time. So summer and winter, these are the core or resident species in the system. And then you have some species that are mostly seen or consuming one of the seasons. And these are just the species turnover that is happening in the system. But what is important is also that you now see that in color, you have interactions that are only happening between resident species in summer or in winter. So of course, I mean, if you introduce a species in one particular season, the interactions that are going to establish with the other species are going to be new. But the interaction that we are interested in is among these core of species. Those are the ones that are active, and the changes that we see in this particular case are the ones that are giving us a sense of reorganization in the system. So, okay. So now here would be like in a matrix representation. Here you can see in black our core of species, and these gray circles, squares would correspond to the seasonal species interacting. So here you have predators, and here you have prey, right, on the columns, and each dot would represent one interaction. Black ones would correspond to those interactions among resident species, and these colors, squares would correspond only to this reorganization that is happening. So these is basically the color squares are showing you the reorganization that is happening in the system. Yes?
This is the Witty network or structure?
Only structure in this case. We only have topology.
Why you have these colors?
So the colors, as I mentioned, was just to show you that the black colors would mean those interactions that never change. So they are the same in summer and in winter. And here you see that this one here is only present in summer, whereas this is only present in winter. So it's just to show you that there is this sense of reorganization in the system. Now we have to go to the dynamics. And again, I was just showing you at the beginning this mutualistic model for my system. Now we have a different system, so that is predator and prey, which can be modeled by a consumer resource system. So here you have the equations for consumers or predators, and here the equation for resources or predators. So in this case, consumers have a mortality rate. So before I was talking about intrinsic growth rates. Now these are mortalities are negative, meaning that consumers cannot live without trade, without resources. So if you have a lion, don't give him food and it's going to die. So that's basically representing this thing. And here would be the effect of consumer my prey. And in the prey sense, you have the intrinsic growth rate minus the effect of itself. So this intra-competition that you were mentioning, minus the effect that the predator has on the prey. And now if we remember, of course we have all these parameters that we have no clue about how to put them into our equation, but what we are interested is just at least to see again what would be the conditions under which my system coexists, under which all my species coexist. So meaning that the abundances at equilibrium are larger than zero. And the conditions for this, if we solve this to equilibrium, putting these two equations to zero, then we end up that basically the mortality rate and the intrinsic growth rate would be given by the interaction matrix again. So we can we can use our feasibility approach that we were using before to try to understand then the parameter space of the mortality rates and the intrinsic growth rates of resources in order to see what is going on in the system. So geometrically, what we have is now, if you look at it, we have, these are two positive parameter values, right? So in this case, it's negative, but if we put it on the other side, it becomes positive. Yes?
So here you assume that, I mean, you take your parameters by finding the equations of equilibrium, so yeah. The thing is like precisely the difference, I mean, you mentioned that the network changes from winter to summer. So I'm just saying, like, how could this affect your equilibrium? In the sense, it's not that equilibrium because precisely moving from up and down. So it's just say, I may have gone with, I don't know, some kind of Fourier analysis or something that takes in account that there's cycles there. And that's, I mean, could that, for instance, I don't know, like if it's always if it's always summer, then pests like locust or whatever, they would eat all your crops because they never die in winter. So that would be a simple system that would not reach equilibrium precisely because there's a change of topology. And how would you account for that, for instance?
Yeah, so in that sense, here what we are just, obviously what we are interested in is the effect that short-term dynamics, like reorganization, would have on the long-term persistence. Of course, I mean, you might have changes in terms of cycles or things like, although I must say that in this kind of system it's very difficult to see cycles. But it's a genuine question. I think that then the approach would be different. I mean, as you said, I mean, I would never be using the Lotka-Volterra equation because then, but what I would like just to show you is like, just with these simple ideas, you can start understanding where the system is going. So give me 5 minutes, and if I don't convince you, then I can come back to that. So basically, the idea is that now we can do the same analysis as before, like looking at the parameter space that, so mortality rates and intrinsic growth rates that would allow me, or the system, to have all the species alive, happy, right? And we can do that based again on the column vectors. So each vector here of Mies feasibility domain corresponds to the column vectors of the interaction matrix, as before. And what we are interested then is to see the fraction, right, as we were doing before, in this unit triangle, now in this case. It's a triangle because now we're working on a positive worth rate. Before, our intrinsic growth rates were positive or negative. Now here I'm constraining that all my parameter values have to be positive so I can work more easily on this aspect. And then the equation is reduced more easily to this simple omega here, which is function of my interaction matrix, which is basically the determinant of this matrix A divided by the L1. Which is just basically, it's pure geometry, nothing more. It's just trying to get the fraction of this inner triangle relative to the big one. That's all I'm just looking at. So now what we can ask is, okay, so now I have these two domains of feasibility, one given by the summer network and one given by the winter network. And one question is like whether this reorganization that is happening is actually separating my system so that I would never be able to have one single set of parameters, as you were mentioning, or is actually the reorganization is somehow reducing this space given by some species turnover that is happening in the system. So what we were trying to see here is like, if we look at the long-term persistence, what would be the conditions, what would be the ideal conditions, if I may, that would allow my system to remain in the system across time. And if those conditions would change as a function of this reorganization that is happening in the system. So now if I go and apply my omega equation into my summer and winter networks, we end up with two values. Well, that is basically a likelihood that you might see quite low, but it's actually, when you start dealing with very large systems, that's more or less what you can end up with. The larger the system, obviously, the less likely that you might assemble it in some specific way that in order for everybody to be happy and be alive in the system. But what it's telling you here is just that there is a distance, basically, as the cartoon. There is a distance between the ideal conditions in summer and the ideal conditions in winter. Now, so far, we don't know whether this distance is mainly driven by the changes in the species composition. So remember that there were some species that were entering in summer, others in winter, or is basically driven by the reorganization of the system. So how can we disentangle these two effects? So if we go back to our network, we can remember that, okay, we had these permanent interactions, we had these seasonal interactions, meaning our reorganization. So one way in which we can then quantify the extent to which this distance between summer and winter is given by the reorganization is basically we can look for all the configurations that we have here. So now, so in this case, let's say we have 75% of the interactions among resident species are permanent. The other 25% are the color ones. So now we can choose 75% of these interactions randomly and to stick them and to say, okay, now these are going to be the new 75% of permanent interactions, and then the 25% of remaining species interactions are going to be also randomly selected, but in a different way. So we're just basically, every time we're just getting different configurations of the same number of permanent interactions and seasonal interactions. So with each new configuration, we're going to be again calculating our feasibility domains. So one possible scenario, so before I was just showing that this is the distance, the observed distance between summer and winter. One possible scenario is that perhaps, as in the mutualistic case, now the network that we observe is actually maximizing the feasibility domain, the possibilities in which my system can coexist in both cases.